The dust had barely settled on the ruins of the Third Reich when millions of German women discovered something that would shatter everything they believed. The spring of 1945 brought Allied armies streaming across the Rhine. German soil trembled under foreign boots, hearts pounded with terror, bred by years of Nazi warnings. What happened next defied every expectation. The propaganda machine had worked overtime. German women braced for horrors beyond imagination, systematic brutality, torture. Death might be preferable to what awaited them. The Reich Ministry had painted vivid pictures of Allied savagery. American soldiers would show no mercy, no compassion, no humanity whatsoever. Then the tanks rolled into town. Everything changed in those first moments of contact. The collision between expectation and reality created shockwaves that rippled through German society. Women who had prepared for the worst encountered something they never saw coming. Respect, courtesy, even kindness from their conquerors. Winter had been merciless to Germany in 1944. Cities lay in smoking rubble. Families huddled in basements. Food vanished from store shelves. Fuel became more precious than gold. German women watched their world collapse around them. Many were widows now. Others waited for husbands who would never return from distant battlefields. The 1,000-year Reich was dying. Everyone knew it. Everyone felt it in their bones. American forces understood their role perfectly. Military guidelines spelled it out clearly. You are entering enemy territory. These people fought against us. They supported our enemies. They are not friends. They are not allies. Treat them accordingly. But something unexpected began unfolding in those first encounters. Reality refused to match the script either side had been given. Nazi propaganda had reached fever pitch in those final months. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda worked frantically. Radio broadcasts filled the airwaves with warnings. Leaflets appeared on every street corner. The message was always the same. The Allies would show no mercy to German civilians. Women especially faced terrible fates. The propaganda painted pictures of systematic violence, mass enslavement, treatment so brutal that death would seem like freedom. German testimonies from that spring spoke of absolute terror. One woman wrote that she refused to become a slave for another people. Life would hold no joy under such conditions. The fear consumed entire communities. Thousands chose suicide rather than face capture. Fathers killed their families before taking their own lives. Mothers poisoned their children to spare them from Allied brutality. The mass suicides became a defining tragedy of Germany's final collapse. But the first encounters told a different story entirely. A German mayor recorded his amazement in the spring of 1945. His community had prepared for the worst. They expected rough treatment from occupying forces. The impression had been left that serious hardships lay ahead. Instead, after 24 hours with American troops, all fears had evaporated. The soldiers showed remarkable courtesy. Their manner was mild. Their behavior contrasted sharply with German military attitudes. The domineering nature of their own forces seemed harsh by comparison. This pattern repeated across Germany. Children had imagined Americans as wild savages, bands of brutal warriors straight from adventure stories. Instead, they encountered young men who shared chocolate bars, soldiers who smiled and waved, occupiers who seemed almost impossibly well-mannered. The contrast struck everyone who witnessed it. American abundance played a crucial role in shaping these encounters. German rations had dwindled to almost nothing. Families survived on potato peels and ersatz coffee. Meanwhile, American soldiers seemed to have unlimited supplies of everything Germans desperately needed. Chocolate bars appeared like magic from military pockets. Cigarettes became unofficial currency. Chewing gum represented luxury beyond imagination. Nylon stockings transformed into treasures worth fortunes on the black market. The GIs distributed these items with casual generosity that amazed German observers. But material wealth was only part of the story. Something deeper was at work here. American military culture operated on principles that German women recognized immediately. The troops showed respect for private property. They acknowledged civilian rights. Their behavior toward local populations differed dramatically from German military standards. One witness noted that American forces demonstrated far more consideration for village inhabitants than German troops ever had. This consideration extended to personal interactions. Individual dignity seemed to matter to these foreign soldiers. The contrast with Eastern Europe was stark and terrifying. Soviet forces had earned reputations for widespread violence against civilian populations. Stories filtered westward about mass attacks on women. Estimates suggested that up to 2 million German women faced assault by Red Army soldiers. German civilians fled westward in desperate attempts to reach American and British lines. Better to surrender to Western forces than face the Red Army's vengeance. The choice often meant the difference between survival and destruction. In the American zone, different patterns emerged entirely. General Eisenhower had implemented strict non-fraternization policies throughout Allied occupation forces. The rules were extraordinarily restrictive at first. American soldiers could not speak to German adults. They were forbidden from entering German homes. Social contact of any kind was prohibited. Even paying maintenance for children they might have fathered was considered aiding the enemy. The policy was designed to maintain military discipline and prevent security breaches. It was also meant to demonstrate Allied disapproval of German society. But this policy created unexpected dynamics. Rather than leading to exploitation, it often resulted in formal distance that German women found surprisingly respectful. Here were occupying soldiers who were actually prohibited by their own command from taking anything by force. The rigid rules proved impossible to enforce in practice. Soldiers at every level resisted the fraternization ban. Many had to work directly with Germans to re-establish local government and industrial operations. Others sought out civilian company or participated in black market trading. Some simply felt compassion for desperate people struggling to survive. Even as the policy broke down, it did so in ways that continued to surprise German women. When American soldiers bent the rules, they often did so to show kindness rather than exploit their power. Acts of generosity replaced expected brutality. Later in the occupation, GIs drove through German towns in large American sedans. They offered rides to curious children. Young German women climbed into cars with their former enemies. This behavior looked nothing like conquest in the traditional sense. It resembled American-style courtship instead. The cultural gap was enormous and obvious. German women had endured years of wartime shortages and increasingly harsh military discipline. Now they encountered young men who seemed impossibly well-fed and well-supplied. Most surprising of all, these soldiers appeared remarkably well-mannered. Policy changes came gradually but inevitably. In June 1945, the prohibition against speaking with German children became less strict. July brought permission to speak with German adults in certain circumstances. Soldiers happily called the rule "change the fraternization order." Some military units even began sponsoring official social events. They invited girls of good character to dances and parties. By November 1945, surveys found that 56% of American soldiers had spoken with German women during the previous week. a quarter had spent 10 hours or more in their company. What emerged was not the brutal exploitation Nazi propaganda had promised. Instead, something resembling normal courtship developed, complicated by cultural differences, language barriers, and the surreal context of military occupation. But this story was not without its dark chapters. Sexual violence did occur during the occupation. According to military prosecutors, German women faced more frequent injury and abuse from American forces than from British or French troops. Professor Miriam Gebhardt estimates that 190,000 sexual assaults were committed by American troops during the defeat of Nazi Germany and the subsequent decade. Racial dynamics complicated the justice system. Black GIs faced punishment from superiors far more often than white soldiers who committed identical crimes. The military justice system reflected broader American prejudices, even in occupied Germany. The overall pattern differed significantly from German expectations. The majority of documented assaults occurred in the Soviet occupation zone. Soviet atrocities during the conquest of Germany, especially mass attacks on German women by Red Army soldiers, confirmed the worst fears about occupation forces. German women quickly learned to distinguish between different occupying armies. Desperate efforts were made to reach British and American lines before Soviet forces arrived. The choice of surrender location often determined survival. Something remarkable was happening in the American zone. African American soldiers, segregated within the U.S. military, often developed particularly positive relationships with German civilians. Germans frequently found black soldiers more affable, modest, courteous, and compassionate than their white counterparts. Black GIs were remembered as especially kind-hearted and generous toward children. They responded with particular sensitivity to the stark misery of German civilians after the war. In villages near Ulm, nearly every German household reportedly had its own relationship with a black soldier who supplied scarce food and goods. German women in some localities refused to take in laundry from white soldiers if black troops were stationed nearby. The black soldiers apparently compensated more generously for such services. The irony was profound and inescapable. Nazi racial ideology had taught Germans to view African Americans as inferior beings. Yet many German women discovered that these soldiers were among the most generous and considerate of their occupiers. Cultural learning accelerated as summer turned to autumn in 1945. The initial shock of occupation was wearing off, but new discoveries continued daily. German women realized that American soldiers, far from being brutal conquerors, were often lonely young men missing their homes. They seemed eager for female companionship. They appeared surprisingly willing to share their abundant supplies. This created complications nobody had anticipated. American soldiers' attitudes shifted when they saw the relative affluence of German homes. Many conquerors became more bitter toward German civilians after witnessing their material abundance. Americans assumed that Germans had looted much of this wealth from conquered countries. The sight of well-furnished German houses shocked soldiers who had encountered millions of malnourished, displaced persons throughout Europe. These men, women, and children had been forced to work as slaves in German factories and fields. Some American soldiers became more willing to destroy or loot German property after making these discoveries. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Polk wrote to his wife expressing his desire to burn every German town to the ground. He wanted to shell every place before occupation to bring home to women and children the hell that Germany had inflicted upon the world. Yet even these hardened attitudes often softened through direct human contact. American soldiers found fraternization surprisingly easy because of a curious phenomenon. There seemed to be a complete absence of Nazis among German civilians after the surrender. Soldiers had expected to encounter a population full of devoted Nazi supporters. Instead, Few Germans they met outside armed forces and party administration admitted to any Nazi sympathies once defeat was certain. This absence of obvious Nazi supporters created an atmosphere where individual relationships could develop more naturally. German women who expected brutal occupiers found themselves dealing with young men who seemed genuinely interested in them as individuals. These soldiers saw them as women, not as representatives of a defeated enemy nation. Winter 1945 brought unprecedented challenges. Germany's infrastructure lay completely in ruins. People survived on starvation rations that barely sustained life. In this environment, American abundance became even more striking and significant. A single chocolate bar could mean survival for a German family. A pack of cigarettes represented currency worth more than money. Nylon stockings became treasures that could be traded for weeks of food supplies. This created complex moral situations for German women struggling to keep their families alive. Some historians argue that economic desperation in occupied Germany meant many relationships between German women and Allied soldiers occurred under circumstances where genuine choice was severely limited. Women faced pressure to form compliant relationships for protection and survival. The boundary between coercion and consent was often blurred by desperate circumstances. Much of the work available to women involved systematic sexual harassment. Many turned to prostitution to avoid violence or starvation. Yet within this morally ambiguous situation, many German women discovered that American soldiers were often respectful partners who genuinely cared about their welfare. The expected exploitation frequently gave way to surprising tenderness and concern. As winter gave way to spring 1946, clear patterns were emerging from the chaos. Marriages between American soldiers and German women became officially permitted in December 1946. Austrian women had been allowed to marry American soldiers beginning in January of that year. The relationships that developed challenged everyone's preconceptions in fundamental ways. German women expecting treatment as conquered subjects found themselves being courted like potential wives. American soldiers, taught to see all Germans as Nazi supporters, found themselves falling in love with women whose primary crime was being born in the wrong country. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Prohibitions that initially included all interactions with German citizens had given way to organized social events and officially sanctioned courtship by late 1945. But this transformation created new tensions and complications. Women who formed relationships with Allied soldiers found themselves caught in impossible situations. They desperately needed the food and supplies that relationships could provide. They also wanted to escape Germany through marriage to foreign soldiers. These same women were least likely to succeed because Western masculine double standards still branded them as prostitutes, even when their relationships were completely genuine and loving. German society remained deeply conflicted about these cross-cultural relationships. Many German women faced verbal abuse from their own countrymen for being Allied whores. They received threatening letters from German men who viewed their relationships as betrayal. Yet the human connections continued to deepen despite social pressure. As the first anniversary of surrender approached, the story was far from over. What had begun as temporary military occupation was becoming something more permanent and significant. Both German women and American soldiers were discovering that the transition from enemies to lovers was more complicated than either side had imagined. The winter of 1945 to 1946 proved to be one of the harshest on record. Germany's infrastructure remained in complete ruins. Heating fuel was virtually non-existent throughout the country. Food supplies remained critically scarce for civilian populations. In this desperate environment, relationships between German women and American soldiers took on dimensions that transcended romance or simple survival strategies. For many German women, an American boyfriend had become a genuine lifeline, not just for herself, but for her entire extended family. The chocolate bars and cigarettes that had once seemed like generous gifts were now recognized as essential currency in a completely devastated economy. A single carton of American cigarettes could be traded on the black market for enough food to feed a family for an entire week. This economic reality created moral complexities that neither side had fully anticipated when relationships first began forming. Anna, a 23-year-old widow from Munich, later reflected on her relationship with an American sergeant during this period. She told herself she cared for him, and perhaps she genuinely did feel affection. But when her children were crying from hunger every night, how could she separate her feelings for the man from her gratitude for the food he brought to her family? These relationships challenged traditional notions of romance, survival, and national identity in ways that nobody had prepared for. German women found themselves navigating not just language barriers and cultural differences, but fundamental questions about what it meant to find love with a former enemy while their own country lay in complete ruins. For American soldiers, the situation was equally complex and emotionally challenging. Many had arrived in Germany expecting to find a nation populated entirely by Nazi fanatics. Instead, they discovered ordinary people struggling desperately to survive in extraordinary circumstances. The psychological adjustment required was immense and ongoing. Corporal Robert Martinez from Texas wrote to his sister in early 1946, expressing his confusion. These people weren't what American soldiers had expected at all. Sure, they had supported Hitler's regime, but when you witnessed a mother trying to feed her children with potato peels, it became impossible to think of her as the enemy. It made soldiers wonder what they were really accomplishing in Germany. American military command struggled continuously with these evolving relationships between their soldiers and German civilians. While the formal non-fraternization policy had been officially abandoned, military authorities remained deeply concerned about security risks, the rapid spread of venereal diseases, and serious impacts on military discipline. Venereal disease rates rose dramatically from 50 to 190 cases per 1,000 soldiers in just the first 3 months of occupation. By the end of 1945, rates had climbed to more than 250 cases per 1,000. The fraternization prohibition had probably discouraged soldiers from obtaining prophylactics or requesting proper medical treatment. But military concerns extended far beyond health issues and disease control. As relationships between German women and American soldiers became increasingly serious and long-term, complex questions arose about marriage procedures, citizenship rights, and the long-term presence of American families in occupied territory. Policy regarding marriages reflected the military's deep ambivalence about these developing relationships. Marriages between American soldiers and Austrian women were not permitted until January 1946. Permission for marriages with German women was delayed until December 1946. Even after official permission was granted, the marriage process was deliberately complicated and bureaucratic. Extensive background checks were required. Waiting periods stretched for months. Approval from commanding officers was mandatory for every case. These restrictions created a peculiar situation where American soldiers could maintain intimate relationships with German women but were forbidden from making those relationships legally permanent. This led to a parallel system of informal marriages and common law relationships that military authorities could neither fully control nor completely ignore. By mid-1946, military estimates suggested that nearly 40% of American soldiers stationed in Germany had developed some form of ongoing relationship with German women. These relationships ranged from casual dating arrangements to deeply committed partnerships that would endure for decades. The cultural exchange that resulted from these relationships was unprecedented in scope and significance. German women learned American slang and developed tastes for jazz music and Hollywood movies. They adopted American dating customs that scandalized older generations of Germans. American soldiers, meanwhile, learned German cooking techniques and acquired European sensibilities about art and literature. Many developed more sophisticated understanding of history and politics through conversations with educated German women. This cultural blending was particularly evident in the children born from these relationships across occupied Germany. According to Federal Statistics Office figures from 1956, approximately 68,000 occupation children were born to German women between 1945 and 1955. The breakdown by nationality was revealing. 55% were fathered by Americans, 15% by French soldiers, 13% by British forces, 5% by Soviet troops, 3% by Belgian soldiers, 10% by other nationalities. These children represented an entirely new generation that would grow up straddling two distinct cultures. They spoke both German and English fluently. They were equally comfortable with bratwurst and hamburgers, Beethoven and Benny Goodman. But the path to social acceptance was neither smooth nor guaranteed for these families. German society remained deeply conflicted about relationships between German women and Allied soldiers throughout the occupation period. Traditional German values emphasized female purity and unwavering national loyalty, making these cross-cultural romances controversial even when they were obviously genuine and lasting. The term Ami Liebchen, meaning American girlfriend, became both a simple descriptor and a subtle insult, depending on who used it. Women involved with American soldiers faced social ostracism from some quarters, while receiving envious attention from others who coveted their access to American goods and military protection. Martha, a secretary from Frankfurt who married an American lieutenant in 1947, remembered the intense social pressure she faced. Her own mother told her she was betraying Germany by marrying the enemy. But when she saw how well the American husband treated her daughter, how he helped rebuild their house and brought medicine for her sick father, attitudes began to change. It took considerable time, but eventually her mother came to love her son-in-law like her own son. American soldiers faced their own social pressures from families back home. Letters from the United States often reflected the complex emotions of American families, trying to understand why their sons and brothers were forming intimate relationships with women from the enemy nation. One soldier wrote to his parents in Ohio, explaining his desire to marry a German woman named Greta. He knew his parents didn't understand his feelings. She wasn't like what Americans thought German women were. She was kind and funny, and she made him feel at peace for the first time since leaving home. The war was over, he reminded them. They couldn't hate forever. These personal relationships began to influence American policy toward Germany in subtle but increasingly important ways. Soldiers who had German girlfriends or wives became strong advocates for more generous Reconstruction policies. They witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of Allied bombing campaigns on civilian populations. They became supporters of aid programs that might otherwise have been viewed as inappropriately helping former enemies. The Marshall Plan, announced in June 1947, reflected in part this changing American attitude toward Germany. While strategic concerns about Soviet expansion provided the primary motivation, humanitarian arguments for rebuilding Germany were strengthened by thousands of American soldiers who had formed deep personal connections with German families. As the Cold War began reshaping European politics, relationships between German women and American soldiers took on new geopolitical significance. Germany, once the primary enemy, was rapidly becoming America's most important ally in the developing struggle against Soviet communism. The personal relationships that had developed during military occupation became powerful symbols of this broader diplomatic and military alliance. But the Cold War also brought entirely new complications to existing relationships. The division of Germany into eastern and western zones meant that some couples found themselves separated by what would become known as the Iron Curtain. Women in East Germany who had developed relationships with American soldiers before the zones hardened often faced severe persecution from communist authorities who viewed such relationships as clear evidence of Western sympathies and potential espionage connections. Ingrid, a nurse from Berlin who had fallen in love with an American medic, found herself trapped in the Soviet sector when the city was officially divided. She wrote years later about waiting and hoping for 3 years that he would find some way to get her out of East Germany. When the Berlin Wall went up in 1961, she finally accepted that their love story was permanently over. The Cold War had claimed another casualty among the thousands of separated couples. For couples fortunate enough to be in West Germany, the situation remained hopeful, but still presented significant challenges. American soldiers who wanted to marry German women and take them back to the United States faced complex bureaucratic processes that could take months or even years to complete successfully. The War Brides Act of 1945 had been designed primarily for European women who had married American soldiers in Allied countries during the war. Extending these legal provisions to include German women required overcoming significant political resistance in the United States, where anti-German sentiment remained surprisingly strong well into the 1950s. Despite these substantial obstacles, approximately 60,000 German women eventually emigrated to the United States as military wives between 1945 and 1960. These women, often called war brides, faced enormous challenges adapting to American society while trying to maintain their German cultural identity. Their experiences in America varied dramatically from case to case. Some thrived in their new country, becoming fully integrated into American communities, while still preserving German traditions for their children and grandchildren. Others struggled with persistent homesickness, language barriers, and cultural isolation, particularly those who settled in small rural towns, where they might be the only German speaker for hundreds of miles around. Rosa, who married a soldier from Kansas and moved to a farming community in 1948, recalled her difficult early years in America. Everything was completely different from what she had known. The food, the way people talked to each other, even the way they raised their children was foreign to her. She missed Germany terribly during those first years, but she also knew she could never return to her homeland. This was her new life, and she was determined to make it work, regardless of the challenges. The long-term success of these marriages proved to be remarkable by any measure. Studies conducted in the 1970s found that divorce rates among German war brides were actually lower than the general American average, suggesting that relationships forged during military occupation were often built on surprisingly solid foundations, despite their unusual and complicated origins. But success required substantial adaptation from both marriage partners. American husbands had to learn to appreciate European customs and different approaches to family life, while German wives had to navigate unfamiliar American social expectations and cultural norms. The children of these marriages often became important cultural bridges, equally comfortable in German and American environments. They grew up truly bilingual and bicultural, in ways that gave them unique perspectives on both societies. By the 1950s, as West Germany emerged as a stable democracy and crucial American ally, the relationships that had begun during military occupation were increasingly viewed as powerful symbols of successful reconciliation between former enemies. Former adversaries had become not just political allies, but actual family members connected by marriage and children. The transformation was unprecedented in the history of warfare and international relations. The impact on German society proved to be profound and lasting. The generation of German women who had developed relationships with American soldiers during the occupation became influential advocates for democracy, women's rights, and international cooperation throughout the post-war period. They had experienced firsthand that Americans were not the monsters Nazi propaganda had portrayed them to be. Their direct experiences helped reshape fundamental German attitudes toward the United States and Western democratic values. These women also played crucial roles in Germany's post-war democratization process. Having experienced American informal social customs and relatively egalitarian gender relations, they became strong advocates for women's participation in politics and the workforce. Many of the prominent German women's rights activists of the 1950s and 1960s had their first significant exposure to feminist ideas through relationships with American soldiers during the occupation years. The cultural exchange flowed in both directions across the Atlantic. American soldiers who had served in Germany often returned home with more sophisticated tastes in food, music, and literature. They became advocates for foreign language education, international travel, and cultural exchange programs. Many pursued careers in diplomacy, international business, or education, carrying with them positive memories of German culture and people that influenced their professional work for decades. The children of German-American relationships frequently became leaders in promoting international understanding and cooperation. Growing up bilingual and bicultural gave them unique insights into both societies, and they often became translators, diplomats, journalists, and scholars specializing in German-American relations. Several key lessons emerge from this remarkable period in the relationships between German women and American soldiers during the occupation years. First, the extraordinary power of human connection to overcome deep political divisions became evident. Despite years of intensive war propaganda, designed to dehumanize the enemy on both sides, genuine personal relationships developed quickly once individuals had opportunities to interact as human beings, rather than as representatives of hostile nations. Second, the critical importance of cultural sensitivity in military occupation operations was clearly demonstrated. The relatively respectful behavior of American soldiers, while certainly not universal, created an environment where positive relationships could develop naturally. This stood in stark contrast to areas where occupying forces behaved more brutally, creating lasting resentment and political instability. Third, the significant role of women as agents of cultural and political change became apparent. German women who had relationships with American soldiers became important advocates for democratic values and women's rights in post-war German society. Their experiences during the occupation gave them unique perspectives on gender equality and political freedom that shaped their activism for decades. Fourth, the long-term impact of personal relationships on international relations was clearly demonstrated. The marriages and families that resulted from occupation-era relationships created lasting human connections between Germany and the United States that reinforced broader political and military alliances for generations. Finally, the profound complexity of relationships formed under conditions of military occupation became evident. While many of these relationships proved genuine and lasting, they developed within a context of enormous power imbalances, severe economic desperation, and massive cultural dislocation. Understanding this complexity helps us appreciate both the remarkable human connections that formed during this period and the difficult circumstances that inevitably shaped them. The story of German women and American soldiers during the occupation demonstrates that even in the aftermath of the most destructive war in human history, people consistently found ways to connect across the seemingly insurmountable divides of nationality, language, and former enmity. Their relationships helped heal the psychological wounds of war and laid essential foundations for one of the most important and enduring alliances of the modern era. But perhaps most importantly, their story serves as a powerful reminder that history is ultimately made by individual human beings making personal choices about how to treat each other with dignity and respect. In the ruins of Nazi Germany, amid all the moral complexities of military occupation, thousands of people chose love over hate, understanding over revenge, and hope over despair. The German women who were genuinely shocked when American soldiers treated them with respect rather than brutality, who experienced courtesy rather than exploitation, became active participants in a transformation that fundamentally changed both nations for the better. Their story stands as a lasting testament to the power of human dignity to triumph even in the darkest and most challenging of circumstances. As we remember this important chapter of history, we honor not just the political reconciliation between former enemies, but the personal courage of countless individuals who chose to see humanity in each other when the entire world seemed to tell them to see only enemies worthy of hatred. Their legacy continues to live on in the strong alliance between Germany and the United States, and in the thousands of families whose very existence serves as permanent testimony to the possibility of transforming swords into plowshares and hatred into lasting love. In the end, the greatest shock for German women was not American brutality, as they had been taught to expect, but American humanity expressed through countless small acts of kindness and respect. And in recognizing and responding to that unexpected humanity, they helped create a future that neither side could possibly have imagined when the first American tanks rolled across the German border in the spring of 1945. The story continues to inspire us today, with its message that even the deepest divisions can be healed through human connection, mutual respect, and the courage to see our shared humanity beyond the barriers of politics, nationality, and past conflicts.